They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but mine was served on a silver platter, under crystal chandeliers, in front of everyone who ever mattered to the people who destroyed me. And it tasted sweeter than any wedding cake ever could. I'm Amalinda, and this is the story of how I turned my sister's dream wedding into my own personal resurrection. I was standing in our cramped kitchen on Maple Street, that familiar mix of cheap beer and motor oil hanging in the air like a toxic perfume I'd learned to ignore years ago. My father Frank was hunched over the dining table, not eating dinner like a normal person, but tearing apart some greasy car part, leaving dark stains on the wood my grandmother had once cherished. I remember thinking how that table was like me, scarred and disrespected, its original beauty long forgotten under layers of abuse. My hands were shaking as I forced the words out. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head, lying awake at 3 a.m, trying to find the courage that kept slipping away like sand through my fingers. Liam and I needed help. Just a small amount to secure our booking at the old community church on Fifth Avenue. Nothing extravagant, just enough to make our wedding real. The moment those words left my mouth, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Frank didn't just mock me. He grabbed the oil-stained rag he'd been using and hurled it at the floor near my feet, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. His face twisted into something ugly, something I'd seen too many times before but never quite got used to. "Help? Who the hell do you think you are?" His voice was low and dangerous, the kind of quiet that always preceded the storm. "A wedding? That pathetic firefighter must be blind to want damaged goods like you. I've wasted money feeding you for years, and now you want to bleed me dry for more?" I should have left right then. I should have walked out and never looked back. But I was frozen, trapped by years of conditioning that told me I deserved this, that family meant enduring anything, that somehow I could make them love me if I just tried hard enough. Jessica was sitting on the worn couch in the corner, filing her nails with that bored expression she'd perfected, scrolling through Instagram like this was just another Tuesday evening. She looked up with that smirk I'd come to hate more than anything in the world. "Dad, don't be so harsh." Her voice dripped with false sweetness. "At least she needs a white dress to cover up how cheap she is." She turned to me, her eyes cold and calculating. "Who do you think will even show up to that pathetic excuse for a wedding? Probably just the homeless guys from the corner of Oak and Main, right?" I tried to keep my voice steady, tried to salvage something from this nightmare. "I just wanted family there, that's all. Just family." That's when everything exploded. Frank stood up so fast his metal chair scraped against the linoleum floor with a sound that made my teeth ache. He didn't just kick once. He grabbed a fistful of my hair, his fingers digging into my scalp, and forced me down to my knees. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to what came next. "You want family? This is your place in this family." He drove his knee into my stomach, not once but twice, each impact driving the air from my lungs. It wasn't just about causing pain. It was about humiliation, about making sure I knew exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of the Miller household. Stay down on the floor, that's where you belong. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was curl into myself and try to protect my vital organs while my father stood over me like some kind of twisted conqueror. Jessica didn't just laugh. She pulled out her phone, and I heard the familiar click of her camera. Through blurred vision, I saw her typing something, probably for her private Instagram story. Later I would learn she'd written, "Family drama on a Tuesday," with a crying, laughing emoji. She posted my humiliation for entertainment. The final betrayal came when I heard footsteps and dared to hope someone would help me. My mother Susan walked into the kitchen, took one look at me crumpled on the floor, gasping for air, and simply sighed. Not a gasp of horror, not a cry of concern, just a tired, irritated sigh like I'd spilled milk on the counter. She stepped over me, literally stepped over my body, and said to Jessica, "Jess, honey, don't let this negativity ruin your complexion. Come show me that new dress design you picked out." That indifference hurt more than Frank's knee to my gut. That casual dismissal of my pain, the way she could literally step over my suffering to discuss wedding dresses with my sister, that was the moment something inside me finally cracked. Not broke, not shattered. Cracked. And through that crack, something dark and determined began to grow. I didn't tell Liam everything that night. How could I? How do you explain to the man you love that your own family sees you as less than human? Instead, I said my parents had declined to help and we'd have to save more money. I covered the bruises with thick makeup that I'd learned to apply with practiced precision. I wore loose clothing, even though it was summer in Georgia and the heat was suffocating. The shame was worse than the pain. The shame kept me silent, but beneath that shame, beneath the layers of makeup and loose fabric, something was growing. A plan. A purpose. A promise to myself that I would never, ever kneel on that kitchen floor again. The next few months were hell disguised as normal life. Frank's abuse didn't stop. It evolved, became more creative, more insidious. He'd taken to calling me the leech whenever I was in earshot, sometimes even when guests were over, waiting to see if I'd react, if I'd give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I learned not to cry in front of them. I saved my tears for the shower, where the water could wash away the evidence. Jessica was worse in some ways because her torture was public. She'd started telling our mutual friends from high school that I was a burden on the family, that my upcoming wedding was going to be a circus of sadness, as she so eloquently put it on social media. She had over 3,000 followers by then, and she used every one of them as a weapon against me. The pitying looks I got at the grocery store on Wilson Boulevard, the way conversations would die when I walked into the coffee shop on 3rd Street. It all traced back to Jessica's carefully constructed narrative of me as the family disappointment. The physical sabotage was almost easier to handle than the psychological warfare. Frank accidentally severed a brake line on my beat-up Honda Civic, claiming he was trying to help me fix a noise. I missed 2 shifts at my job at Patterson's Auto Supply because the car wouldn't start. Susan developed a convenient habit of forgetting to cook enough dinner for me, despite the fact that I still lived in their house, paying rent that was probably twice what anyone else would charge. Jessica stole my grandmother's necklace, the only thing I had left from my mother's mother. When I confronted her with proof, she just smiled and said, "Prove it. Who's going to believe you?" But here's what they didn't know. While they were breaking me down, piece by piece, I was building something they would never see coming. I started working double shifts at Rosie's Diner on the edge of town, the place where truck drivers, construction workers, and off-duty cops gathered for coffee that could strip paint and gossip that could ruin lives. I became invisible there, just another waitress in a stained apron, refilling coffee and clearing plates. But I listened. I learned who had influence in our small town of Millbrook. I learned who owed whom favors. I learned which vendors were reliable and which ones would sell you out for an extra $50. Knowledge, I discovered, was its own kind of power. Every dollar I earned from those midnight shifts, every tip left by truckers who appreciated a warm smile and fast service, every penny I could scrape together, I saved. Not in a bank account where Susan might see it. She still had access to my accounts from when I was a minor and never bothered to remove herself. I opened a new account at a bank 2 towns over, one transaction at a time, building my war chest. The Riverside Community Hall was the crown jewel of Millbrook. Built in 1924, restored in 2018, it had hosted every significant event in our town for generations. Jessica had been obsessed with getting married there since she was 14 years old. She had a Pinterest board dedicated to it, over 200 pins of how she'd decorate it, what flowers she'd use, where the band would set up. So, I booked it. 3 months in advance, using a generic name that wouldn't raise any red flags. Miller Family Event was all the reservation said. I paid the deposit in cash, smiled at the manager, Mrs. Henderson, and walked out with a receipt that felt like a weapon in my purse. But I didn't stop there. Jessica announced her engagement to Brad Mitchell, a real estate agent whose family owned half the commercial property in Millbrook. Frank and Susan immediately began planning what they kept calling the wedding of the century. Frank even took out a personal loan to ensure his precious youngest daughter had everything she wanted. I played my part perfectly. I became smaller, quieter, more defeated. I stopped arguing when they mocked me. I became what they expected me to be, a broken thing they'd successfully crushed. And while they celebrated their victory, I was working. I offered to help Jessica plan her wedding. "It's the least I can do," I said with downcast eyes and a trembling voice. She ate it up, of course. What she didn't know was that every vendor she wanted, I contacted first. Magnolia Photography, the best wedding photographers in 3 counties. I booked them for a Miller family event and paid their deposit. The Sweet Notes band that played at the governor's daughter's wedding last year, booked and paid. Anderson's Custom Cakes, famous for their 5-tier masterpieces, booked and paid. Every single vendor Jessica wanted, I got to first. When Jessica called them, they'd tell her they were already booked for a Miller event on that date, and she'd assume Frank had taken care of it. She never double-checked. Why would she? Things always worked out for her. The invitations were my masterpiece. I designed them myself, staying up until 3 in the morning for 2 weeks straight, getting every detail perfect. But here's the genius part. They were deliberately vague. "You are cordially invited to celebrate a special milestone with the Miller family," followed by the date, time, and location of the Riverside Community Hall. No names, no specific event description. Just enough information to make people assume they were being invited to Jessica's wedding. I mailed them to everyone. Frank's co-workers from the automotive repair shop, Susan's entire congregation from Millbrook Baptist Church, Jessica's friends from high school, her sorority sisters, everyone she'd ever mentioned wanting to impress. Over 300 invitations went out, each one a tiny time bomb waiting to explode. Liam knew something was wrong. "Amalinda, baby, are you okay?" he'd ask, his brown eyes full of concern. "We don't need a big wedding. We can go to the courthouse tomorrow if you want." And God, I loved him for that. But I couldn't tell him. Not yet. This wasn't about the wedding. This was about reclaiming something they'd stolen from me. My dignity, my sense of self-worth, my right to take up space in the world. 3 days before the wedding, I moved out quietly while they were all out shopping. I'd already secured a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. Liam helped me move my few possessions, and he held me while I cried, finally allowing myself to feel the weight of what I was about to do. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I told him, and I meant it. The day arrived with perfect weather. September 23rd, sunny and 75 degrees, not a cloud in the sky. I woke up in my new apartment, made coffee in my own kitchen, and put on my wedding dress. It wasn't expensive, just $200 from a consignment shop, but it was beautiful, simple, elegant, with lace sleeves and a flowing skirt that made me feel like someone worth celebrating. We arrived at the Riverside Community Hall at exactly 5:30, 30 minutes after the time on the invitations. The parking lot was already full. Mrs. Henderson, the venue manager, was waiting for us at the entrance. She smiled warmly and shook my hand. "Everything is ready, Miss Miller, just as you requested." That's when I saw them, Frank, Susan, and Jessica, walking across the parking lot. Jessica was wearing a casual designer outfit, probably planning to change into her wedding dress in the bridal suite she thought was reserved for her. Her face, when she saw Mrs. Henderson greeting me, was priceless. "What the hell is going on?" Jessica's voice cut through the pleasant evening air like a knife. "Why is she here, Mrs. Henderson? This is my wedding." Mrs. Henderson didn't miss a beat. "I'm sorry, miss, but I don't have any record of your reservation. The Riverside Community Hall has been booked for Miss Amalinda Miller's event for the past 3 months. All payments and contracts are in her name." Frank's face turned that particular shade of red I'd learned to fear. He started toward the entrance, toward me. "You little bitch, what have you done?" But Liam stepped in front of me, all 6 feet 3 inches of him, and Frank stopped. Say what you want about my father, but he was a coward at heart. He'd hit women and children, but he wouldn't take on a man his own size. The doors opened, and guests began filing into the beautifully decorated hall. They found tables set with white linens and centerpieces of sunflowers and baby's breath. They found programs on each seat that read, "Celebrating the marriage of Amalinda Miller and Liam Foster." The confusion was palpable. Frank grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. "You can't do this. This is Jessica's day. You're ruining everything." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. "Let go of me, Frank, or I'll have security remove you." I'd never called him Frank before. Always Dad or Father. The use of his first name seemed to shock him more than my words. He released my arm like it had burned him. Susan was crying, her carefully applied makeup already starting to run. "Amalinda, please, think about what you're doing. Think about your sister. This will humiliate her." "Like she humiliated me?" I asked softly. "Like all of you have been humiliating me for years?" Jessica was on her phone, frantically calling people. The photographer, the band, the cake maker. One by one, her face fell as they all confirmed they were already at the Riverside Community Hall, setting up for the Miller event they'd been paid to cover. Liam and I made our way to the front of the hall, hand in hand. The guests were seated now, curiosity overcoming their uncertainty. I recognized so many faces. Mr. Patterson, Frank's boss. Mrs. Chen from the church, half of Jessica's sorority sisters, the mayor's wife. Everyone who mattered in Millbrook was there, and they were all watching. I picked up the microphone with surprisingly steady hands. The room fell silent, 300 pairs of eyes fixed on me. "Thank you all for coming," I said, and my voice didn't shake. "I know many of you are confused about why you're here. You were invited to celebrate a Miller family milestone. That milestone is my wedding. My marriage to Liam Foster, the man I love, the man who sees me as someone worthy of love and respect. This is my celebration, my day, my moment." The silence was absolute. Jessica pushed through the crowd toward the stage, her face contorted with rage. "You insane bitch, this is my venue, these are my vendors, you've stolen my wedding." I smiled at her, and it wasn't a nice smile. "Actually, Jessica, these are my vendors. I booked them. I paid them. I have the contracts and receipts to prove it. You assumed Frank had taken care of everything because why would you ever have to worry about anything in your life? Everything's always been handed to you on a silver platter while I've had to fight for scraps." Frank was bellowing something, pushing his way through the confused guests, but I didn't care anymore. This was my moment, and nothing was going to stop me. "Many of you know my family," I continued. "You know Frank Miller, respected mechanic, good Christian man. You know Susan Miller, devoted church member, loving mother. You know Jessica Miller, beautiful, talented, everyone's favorite. But let me show you something you don't know." I nodded to Liam, who was operating the laptop connected to the projection system. The large screen behind the stage lit up, and there it was. Photographs of bruises, dark purple marks on my stomach, fingerprint-shaped bruises on my arms, a split lip, date stamps on each photo, methodically documented over the past 2 years. The gasps from the audience were audible. Susan's sob cut through the shocked silence. But I wasn't done. Next came screenshots of text messages. Jessica's cruel words preserved forever. You're such a burden on this family. God, you're pathetic. Mom and Dad wish they'd stopped at one kid. Message after message, months' worth of psychological torture laid bare for everyone to see. Frank had stopped yelling. He stood frozen in the aisle, his face ashen as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just about a wedding. This was about exposure. This was about accountability. But the final blow was the audio. I'd recorded it on my phone that day in the kitchen. His voice filled the room. You want family? This is your place in this family? Stay down on the floor. That's where you belong. The sound of his fist hitting flesh, my gasp of pain, Jessica's laughter in the background, Susan's dismissive sigh. 300 people heard it. 300 witnesses to a truth I'd been hiding for years. Mrs. Chen stood up and walked out, her face a mask of disgust. Others followed. Not everyone, but enough. Mr. Patterson stared at Frank with undisguised revulsion before turning and leaving. Jessica's sorority sisters were recording on their phones, and I knew this would be all over social media within the hour. Susan was hysterical now, trying to push her way to the stage, mascara streaming down her face. Turn it off! Please, Amelinda, turn it off! You're destroying us! I'm destroying you? I asked, letting anger color my voice. You destroyed me, Mom. Every day, little by little, you stood by and watched him hurt me. You stepped over me like I was garbage on the floor. You chose Jessica over me every single time, and now you want me to protect you from the consequences of your choices? Jessica had collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Frank just stood there, silent for once in his miserable life. His boss had left. His poker buddies had left. The respect he'd spent decades building was evaporating. I turned away from them and looked at the people who had stayed. Fewer than before, maybe 75 out of the original 300. But they were smiling. Some were applauding. These were my people. For those of you who chose to stay, I said, my voice softer now, thank you. You're here because you believe in truth, in accountability, in the idea that abuse should not be hidden behind closed doors. And you're here because, apparently, you want to see me get married. Laughter rippled through the remaining crowd, warm and genuine. The mayor's wife stood up. I'll stay. And I'm honored to witness your wedding, Amelinda. You're one of the bravest young women I've ever met. Frank, Susan, and Jessica left then. Not with dignity, but with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. Jessica was still crying. Susan kept looking back. Frank just walked, and for once, he looked small. I should have felt guilty, but I felt nothing but relief. The weight I'd been carrying for 26 years lifted off my shoulders. The officiant, a retired judge, stepped up to the stage. Well, he said with a wry smile, I've presided over a lot of weddings, but this is definitely the most memorable. Shall we proceed? And we did. Standing there in front of people who chose to see me, to support me, to celebrate with me, Liam and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. He promised to always see me, to never let me disappear into the background of my own life. I promised to never again accept less than I deserved, to stand up for myself, to believe I was worth fighting for. When the judge pronounced us husband and wife and Liam kissed me, the applause from our 75 guests sounded like thunder. They weren't just celebrating a wedding, they were celebrating survival. The reception was beautiful. The band played music that made people want to dance. The photographer took pictures that captured not just moments but emotions. The 3-tier cake with cascading sunflowers was delicious, and there was plenty for everyone. People came up to share their own stories. My former teacher told me about her abusive first marriage. A man from the Baptist church talked about growing up with an alcoholic father. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about her sister who died in a domestic violence situation. My story had given them permission to speak their truths. Around 9 o'clock, Liam and I stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The September night was cool and clear, stars visible despite the glow from the hall's lights. He put his arm around me, and I leaned into his warmth. Are you okay? He asked softly. Really okay? I thought about it, taking inventory of my feelings. There was sadness there, grief for the family I'd never really had. There was anger still, probably something I'd need to work through in therapy. But mostly, there was peace. I'm better than okay, I told him. For the first time in my life, I feel free. We went back inside for our first dance as husband and wife. The band played At Last by Etta James, and as Liam spun me around the dance floor, I caught glimpses of smiling faces, of joy uncomplicated by cruelty or manipulation. This was what celebration should feel like. That night, lying in our bed in our tiny apartment, Liam asleep beside me, I thought about what came next. Frank, Susan, and Jessica were still out there, probably plotting, probably furious. The recording and photos were already circulating online, but their opinions didn't matter anymore. Their approval didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd taken back my narrative. I'd refused to be a silent victim. I'd transformed what was supposed to be Jessica's moment of glory into my moment of liberation. In the weeks that followed, life found its rhythm. I started therapy with Dr. Lisa Newman, a trauma specialist. The first session was hard, but Dr. Newman was patient. We worked on identifying the patterns of abuse, understanding how Frank had conditioned me to accept violence, how Susan had enabled it, how Jessica had learned that cruelty without consequences was acceptable. Understanding helped me stop blaming myself. Mr. Patterson reached out after the wedding, offering me a promotion to assistant manager at the auto supply store. The raise wasn't huge, but it made our little apartment feel less precarious. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with, people I'd drifted away from because Frank and Susan had convinced me I wasn't worth anyone's time. The legal fallout was messy but satisfying. Frank's employer demoted him after several employees came forward with complaints about his aggressive behavior. My exposure had given others permission to speak up. His income dropped significantly, and with Jessica's wedding debt hanging over him, he had to sell his prized motorcycle and boat. Susan lost her position, leading the women's Bible study at church. Jessica's engagement to Brad ended 3 months later. Her social media presence never recovered. 6 months after the wedding, I ran into Susan at the grocery store. We both froze, staring at each other across the produce section. She looked older, tired, the careful maintenance replaced with something more haggard. For a moment I thought she might say something. Instead, she just looked at me with something that might have been regret or resentment, and walked away. I didn't chase her. I didn't need closure from her. I'd found it on my own terms, in therapy sessions, in my tiny apartment with my patient husband, in the small acts of living a life free from fear. Healing didn't require their participation. It only required my decision to stop letting them define my worth. Liam and I started planning for the future. We talked about moving to a bigger place, maybe buying a small house. We discussed whether we wanted children and agreed we did, but only after more healing, only when I was sure I could break the cycle. We dreamed about opening our own business someday. The dreams felt real now, achievable. On our first anniversary, we went back to the Riverside Community Hall. Mrs. Henderson had saved the date for us, refusing payment. We threw a small party with the people who'd stayed at our wedding and new friends we'd made. It was intimate and joyful and completely drama-free. During dinner, Mrs. Rodriguez gave a toast that made me cry. A year ago, Amalinda taught us something important. She taught us that silence protects abusers, not victims. She taught us that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to treat you with respect. To Amalinda and Liam, may your lives be filled with the peace you've earned. As I looked around that room at my chosen family, I realized something profound. The Miller family hadn't just lost their reputation that night. They'd lost me, and I wasn't a burden they'd been freed from. I was the only one who'd ever cared about holding that family together. Without my desperate efforts to earn their love, they'd simply fallen apart. When I removed myself from that equation, there was nothing left. Dancing with Liam under the same lights that had witnessed my liberation a year earlier, I felt something I'd never experienced in my childhood home. I felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. Safe enough to be fully myself. Safe enough to ask for what I needed. Safe enough to believe I deserved good things. Frank had told me my place was on the floor, and for too many years, I'd believed him. But I'd been wrong. My place wasn't on the floor or in the shadows or making myself smaller. My place was exactly where I was standing, in the light, surrounded by love, dancing while people who genuinely cared about me looked on with joy. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but that's not quite right. Revenge isn't about temperature or timing, it's about transformation. It's about taking everything they used to hurt you and turning it into fuel for your freedom. It's about standing on a stage they thought belonged to someone else and claiming it as your own. I didn't destroy my family that night at the Riverside Community Hall. They destroyed themselves years ago with their choices. I just made sure everyone could see what I'd been living with all along. I held up a mirror, and they couldn't stand what they saw reflected back. And me? I walked away from that mirror and into a life of my own making. A life where I wasn't defined by their abuse or limited by their expectations. A life where I could be Amalinda, not just Frank's disappointing daughter or Jessica's pathetic sister, but simply myself. Complicated, imperfect, worthy, free. That's the real revenge. Not destruction, but reconstruction. Not bringing them down, but building myself up. They wanted me on the floor, and I chose to dance instead. And I'm still dancing, every single day, because that's what survival looks like. That's what freedom tastes like. And it's sweeter than any wedding cake could ever be.